Good afternoon. Ooh, so quiet. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. My name is Grace Law, and I am Professor of Architecture and Director of the Master of Architecture program. I'm also chair of the Practice Platform Committee comprised of my faculty colleagues from across the GSD, Florian Eidenberg, Alex Krieger, Paul Nakazawa, Chris Reed, and Jay Wickersham. I'm really, truly grateful for their collaboration on the programming that we are preparing throughout the year. We are also so appreciative to the Dean and to the chairs of all the departments for supporting our efforts, and to the Carl Sapers Fund for assisting in the funding of this event. Today is the inaugural roundtable conversation conceived by this committee entitled Talking Practice. And we intend to have a series of these conversations on matters of practice, which will vary thematically and offer us a concentrated and conscious moment to engage in the reflexive nature of practice. This reflexivity between cause and effect, between thought and action, bends inward upon itself and is inherent to the core of praxis. The project of practice is also recursive, producing an unfinished system ripe for examination. So today's Talking Practice considers expanded modes of contemporary design thinking and the disciplinary potential of these innovative models. Amidst the many new forms of design practice, from hybrid and curatorial practice to open platform and corporate acquisition, we've asked our guests to reflect on the how and why of their practices, sharing concepts, processes, and methods. We are particularly interested in the reciprocal relationships between their practices and moving the boundaries of the discipline. For example, how the discipline develops and deploys knowledge, how the shape of practice is amorphous despite seemingly fixed foci. What are the kinds of knowledge that need to be developed in order to propel both the discipline and practice forward, as well as how we might redefine the interrelationship between the fields of architecture, product, industrial design, and fashion. It is, and it is not, as David Byrne would state, the same as it ever was. We were supposed to have the Talking Heads soundtrack blaring in the background. It's challenging to succinctly introduce our guests, our talking heads for this afternoon, in the short time that we have, as their accomplishments are many and varied. I'm going to do my best and introduce them in the order in which they will present. So these are our folks. Elena Manferdini, she is principal and owner of Atelier Manferdini, founded in 2004. In the past 15 years, she has been involved in architecture, art, design, and education. Atelier Manferdini has completed diverse art and architectural projects in the US, Europe, and Asia. Among her many accomplishments, Elena was recently awarded the 2013 COLA Fellowship by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs to support the production of original artwork. She has also received a Graham Award for Architecture, the 2013 Acadia Innovative Research Award, and the Educator of the Year Presidential Award given by the AIA Los Angeles. In 2011, she was awarded a fellowship from the US Artists in the category of Architecture and Design. Elena currently teaches at SCI-Arc and is the coordinator of the Graduate Thesis program. She's also held visiting professor positions at Cornell, Cal Berkeley, UPenn, and Seika University. Elena received a professional engineering degree from the University of Civil Engineering in Bologna, Italy, and a Master of Architecture and Urban Design from the University of California, UCLA. David Benjamin is founding principal of The Living and assistant professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. The Living infuses new technologies into the built environment, integrating design innovation, sustainability, and the public realm. Clients include the City of New York, Seoul Municipal Government, Nike, Prada, 3M, Airbus, Miami Science Museum, and Eyebeam Center for Art and Technology. Recent projects include the Princeton Architecture Laboratory, a new building for research on next-gen design and construction technologies. Also, Pier 35 EcoPark, Hi-Fi, a branching tower for the Museum of Modern Art, and MoMA PS1, made of a new type of biodegradable brick. Before receiving a Master of Architecture degree from Columbia University, David graduated from Harvard with a BA in Social Studies, and we welcome him back to the university. Aaron Sprecher is an associate professor at the McGill University School of Architecture in Montreal. He is co-founder and partner of Open Source Architecture, a collaborative research group that brings together international researchers in the fields of design, engineering, media research, history, and theory. Graduated from UCLA, his research and design work focuses on the synergy between information technologies, computational languages, and digital fabrication systems. Aaron is the recipient of prestigious research grants, including the Canada Foundation for Innovation grant in 2010, and multiple development grants that support his research activity at the Laboratory for Integrated Prototyping and Hybrid Environments at McGill. Aaron is co-curator and co-editor of the exhibition and catalog, The Genome Project at the MAK Center in LA, exhibition designer of Performalism at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, and Evolutive Means. He is a co-editor of the recent book, Architecture Information on the Nature of Information in Digital Architecture. Ashley Schafer is a writer, designer, educator, and registered architect whose work investigates the intersection of contemporary architecture, urbanism, landscape, history, technology, and practice. She is co-founder and co-editor of PracticeThis, a journal of American architecture. She's also co-curator of the US Pavilion at the 14th International Venice Architecture Biennale and associate professor of architecture at The Ohio State University, where she was head of the architecture program from 2005 to 2009. Previously, Ashley was associate professor at Harvard University here in the Graduate School of Design, and so we are very delighted to welcome her back today. She was also visiting associate professor at MIT and Tulane. She received her undergraduate degree in architecture from UVA and her master's in architecture from Columbia University. Paul Nakazawa is co-moderating this panel with me this afternoon. Paul's work, he works internationally as a consultant and advisor to private and public companies, institutions, and governments. He told me privately that he's in the business of making Pritzker Prize winners. His experience encompasses the fields of strategy and leadership, development, finance and investments, operations management, organizational structure and development, many three-syllable words, as well as large-scale project acquisition and mobilization, mergers and acquisitions, new enterprises and entrepreneurship and international design practice. Paul previously served as a managing principal for multidisciplinary design practices in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Charlotte. He was a founding member of AMO, the research and development arm of OMA. He currently serves as the chairman of Snøhetta's advisory board in New York and is a director of Mass Design Group, Boston. Paul, as you know, many of you are familiar with him, has taught and lectured at the GSD, SCI-Arc, the AA in Mexico City, and also at UNC Charlotte. Paul received his BA and MBA degrees from the University of Chicago and a Master in Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So without further ado, we'll get started. Today we are playing these roles, and after the presenters speak, Paul and I will join the presenters to moderate our conversation, but we also hope that we will have time to open it up to the floor to all of you to ask questions. Elena.
Thank you for the great introduction and for having me here at GSD. I wanted to talk about the difference between discipline and profession, which becomes an important one to make when you practice. It's not always clear where one starts and one ends and when they can hopefully overlap. It also is not very clear until you've done a lot of work when this magic moment happens in your own work. Many things that you do are part of the profession, many things are part of the discipline, and rarely they come together. And I'm going to give a little definition of what I think of discipline, which I think is a personal decision at this point. The discipline of architecture concerns itself with the advancement of the field as an art form. So, and takes the responsibility for advancing the public imagination. Or that's what I think, for me, discipline of architecture is, and what in my office I think has been the core of what you were looking into. And hopefully, the accomplishment of the discipline creative exploration, meaning this collective imagination, eventually becomes something that enters into the practice, into the profession, and sometimes, after a certain amount of endorsement, becomes a stylistic theme of the profession. So often, profession depends upon the work of the discipline. So discipline usually comes first. This creative impulse comes as a first moment. And sometimes the profession of architecture, at least in my office, becomes a reliable, affordable, and sustainable commodity, and that's where things become projects in the sense of professional project. Then architecture interfaces with many other disciplines, or at least in my office do, and design, which I think is profoundly different than architecture, sometimes occupies the same space. If we can say that architecture is born from and engages with culture, design and architecture at some instances occupy the same space when they engages both with the issues of culture. And so in the office, and we'll show you a little bit later, we do engage with many skills of design. Some of them are something that usually you would imagine being industrial design or fashion or object design. And we understand them as being part of the architectural discourse because they inform what we do as architects and what the culture is at the moment. Finally, I'll talk about issues of scale and how they influence each other in my work. Concepts are developed and represented across a range of scales in what I will show you now. And there is a variety of approaches, medias, and outputs that are part of the research, which I think is something common with everybody in the panel today. Finally, this I've never done before, but I thought was useful. I always wanted to know what offices did. I thought, okay, I'm gonna do this for myself. We've been open for 10 years, -5 and +5. And things changed, and this is not accurate in any way, but most of all, I just wanted to make a small reflection of where the work comes from, where the clients come from, where most of the income comes from, and where the interest is in the office and shifted in the past 5 years in relationship to the first 5 years we were in the practice. So how architectural commission or incubator projects or self-given projects somehow changed in this 10 years of practice. I don't know if that's common to anybody else. That's what happened to us. In a way, today I'll show only the margins of the discipline. So how, as my office basically tried to push the design boundaries for architecture to play with. Going to some examples. This is a project we've done in Japan in 2012. It's the redesign of a boat, the outside of the boat and the interior as well. Quite simple concept. We wanted to talk about the idea of the ribbon window and somehow link this to the idea of the view of the landscape and trying to define 3 different story levels of the boat as different level of perception of nature and the different level of the horizon and the different level of the relationship to the water. And this became a way for us to start treating floors and ceilings in relationship to the 360 degrees view around the boat. These are some of the drawings of the various floors of the boats and some of the shots of the finished interior design. Anything that was vertical was either white or chrome, was reflective, and was intended to reflect the landscape coming into the interiors and reflecting the movement of the boat that goes around the lake to look at nature. Also, the idea was to start thinking about the reflection of the water as being multiple water levels that would occupy the ceiling and would start multiple reflections of the ceiling into the floors and vice versa. Up to the core of the boat where all the colors are muted. This just to tell you, somehow, these are not clearly an architectural project as a building, but we think of this becoming an architectural project in the way in which approaches ideas of views, coloration, chromatics, and opens up the level of imagination of the viewer and the users of the boat. Talking about the idea of design and architecture and why they connect to each other, and when they connect to each other, I'm going to show you a set of projects that I specifically chose the projects where we worked with the most commercial clients, like Nike, and how that work developed into a family of projects that then became disciplinary projects for the office. We worked on Nike Sphere in 2005 when we developed a macro textiles and the Sphere collection, which was a tennis line, a sort of dance apparel and shoes. This idea of performance of fabric and cutouts of the fabric then moved into another project, again for another commercial company, Alessi, an Italian company that many of you know. They have this idea of collaborating many times with architects, and they understand design as being something that can span from the spoon to the city. That's a clear relationship to the Bauhaus kind of education, multiple fields, multidisciplinary. And this kind of project somehow informed each other in that period of time and moved into even larger architectural exploration, like this one in 2006, the Beijing Pavilion. So the language and the formation of the language is somehow informed by different scales of exploration, so fashion, industrial design, object design, and pavilions and architectural small installations somehow are linked together in a family of projects. More examples of techniques also that you bring from one field to another in your work that not only has to do with the scale of the project, but also with the tools we're using as architects, being that we have very few platforms really that we all work with. The fact that we connect multiple platforms allow us to go beyond the boundary of what we're doing, and many of the designs that you will see today really deals with this idea of flattening and then redraping, either at small scale, the scale of the body, or at the scale of an installation, something that is a drawing. Again, talking about scale, scalar issues and scalar relationships define a family of projects that are linked to each other, maybe for the way in which they interlock. Like in this case, small furniture is based on geometrical relationship. These geometrical relationships then move from different typologies. The same techniques are used to unfold and refold together objects, up to the point where it becomes a way to understand modularity into a canopy of, this is a Malpensa Airport competition entry for 2015 Expo. Similar techniques are used to model both. Or specific drawings, specific techniques of scripting can go from the production of a drawings to the production of a table, and towards a completely different understanding of a drawing becoming and occupying an architectural entry to a hospital, which is, this one is an art project for LA County. Talking about art, art has a big impact in my practice, and it's sometimes difficult to disconnect them, especially because in Los Angeles, many of us are working on the 1% art projects, meaning that anytime that there is a public building being built, 1% of the cost of the building is given to artwork. Artwork that becomes more and more integrated, to be honest, and it becomes real pieces of the building. One, which is not one of those projects, but one example of the relationship between art and architecture and how they interlace in my practice is given by this small project I've done for the MoCA that started to look at paint and how paint works in terms of color mix and transfer that into digital tools. So a lot of the issue when you swap in between fields is also to understand what techniques were used in another field and how we can appropriate them and they become a trade of architecture. This is to give you some of the example of how I started working with scanning technology and painterly processes on the computer to go from very figural objects to very abstract ones, and how then material quality of mixing color and paint and materiality come together on this palette that is the computer. The project was a small pavilion for the MoCA, where the interiors are this colorful painterly quality, glossy metal with inlays of mirror where you can see yourself reflected into this fantasy. Definitely the project looked at art like James Rosenquist and the idea of having multiple vision at the same time, being able to see multiple images, and how that interlaced cross-hatch then can be used in architecture to start creating multiple fantasies through mirroring qualities. Another project that in many ways defined in my practice the relationship between what we do in terms of artwork is this project for Cola, where we started really from the idea of scanning technologies and bringing real material into the computer, and that became a way for us to understand painterly and to create this image and print mirror that reflects your image within it. That became afterwards part of my office. I wanted to show it because we're talking about practice, and so you can have actually a sense of what it means a small practice like mine. So that's more or less what the project is. The last thing I want to talk about very quickly is the education in architecture, which I think has a lot to do with what I do. I am in an institution that believes as being the discipline of architecture, the main mission of what we teach, and that sustains practice in many different ways. There is no tenure. In many ways, SCI-Arc is built upon the model that professors are practitioners, and what you learn from one to the other is part of what you do. This is the last project. It's a speculative project. And weirdly enough, the speculative projects are the ones that I've been doing more lately than before. So you would imagine that a small practice like mine at the beginning was doing speculative project. The truth is that actually it took a lot to build it up. And right now we're actually working more on speculative project, which is a luxury, I think, for an office to take on. This was a project on Mia's facade that we worked on for the Art Institute in Chicago. We took the most iconic images of Mia's and started weaving them through different scripting textiles. This just to give you a sense of the process. I think it's not moving correctly. All right, this should be moving faster. So these are a set of scripts that built and rebuilt the most important facades of Mia's and interlaced those with idea of colorations and different ideas of fenestrations. So the idea is, again, to how in a practice like mine, then working on a disciplinary project like this one starts informing what we do and how we understand typologies and how we understand something that is so core as the grid. I'm just going to flip through some of the images of the work, which clearly is a very conceptual work we're doing as of now, and really is a study of facades and coloration on facades and types of application of grids on typology of known forms of architecture. I'm going to flip through this very quickly. Just to give you a sense of how then education starts coming into the practice and inform it. As a last sentence, I'm careful to suggest that there is no one public with one imagination, but instead a public comprised of many imagination, worthy of enabling, including many that contradict one another. I just want to say that I think when I talk about discipline, I talk about something that has to do with imagination, and I think there are multiple of those. So while the idealization and abstraction necessary for any and every social agenda are sine qua non of policy, they are not necessarily the main fuel of architecture. Probably the main fuel of architecture in practice is the collective imagination. Thank you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And what I wanted to do today is describe how the living, our architecture and design practice, thinks of design as an ecosystem with interconnected loops of technology, culture, materials, construction, humans, non-humans, and the environment, as well as interconnected loops of different projects by ourselves as kind of experiments, modes of research, connected to the work of others before us, and hopefully leaving links to connect to research that will come in the future. And so for the sake of today's discussion about practice, what I'd like to do is describe 3 different approaches that we've been experimenting with recently, and show 3 different projects that illustrate these 3 approaches. The first one, number 1, designing design space. This is basically an approach that involves the intersection of architecture and design with biology and computation. And it begins with the premise that biology of today is very different than biology of 100 years ago. I mean, of course, architects and designers have been fascinated by biology for many years, including our interest in this book by Darcy Wentworth Thompson. But biology of today looks very different. We're now able to grow cells in glass chips and feed them a wide range of different nutrients and monitor their behavior. We're able to monitor with very high resolution imagery the dynamic and adaptive form of something like these spanning structures of algae. We're able to set up experiments with living organisms like this. This is a slime mold, and monitor the way that it grows to create adaptive networks between nutrients. And then, and this is the important thing, apply that algorithm to designs at a human scale. People are designing highway networks and railway networks from the biological algorithm. We're also able, of course, to visualize some amazing things that weren't possible 100 years ago. This is a live tadpole. You can see the beating of its heart, and the green is the neurons firing in real time of this tadpole. This kind of stuff wasn't possible 100 years ago. We're working with a bunch of different biology labs that allow us a kind of insight into these kind of things. Here are stem cells deciding whether to be liver or bone or heart tissue. And here's the key to me as a designer. We're able to take something like this small circular, very complex form. This is the growth of a bacterial colony about the size of a quarter. And we're able to apply some of the most current techniques of computation to it. Techniques of computer vision, machine learning, data visualization, to try to understand these dynamic and adaptive forms, but more importantly, to be able to apply them. So here's one example. This is work we've done with a synthetic biologist at the University of Cambridge in the UK. We're taking very high-resolution microscope photos at 1 micron section cuts of a xylem cell. This is the cell inside the stem of plants. We're able to recomposite them through computer techniques like MRIs. And then we're able to convert that into a model that we might use as a designer. The important thing here is that we're able to capture xylem growth, the very complex way that a xylem cell will distribute material around a form, a complex form, and we're able to start to mine that for data, so create a spreadsheet of different things like angles, bar lengths, bar thicknesses, feed this spreadsheet into a computer program developed at Cornell by this really interesting computer science lab. And this computer program will take any Excel sheet, any data set, and try to derive a formula to explain it, even if it's a very complex data set. This allows us to get a formula that will be able to recreate something like this, a xylem cell, but more importantly, we can recreate a xylem cell that never existed in nature, that has an L-shaped center line instead of a straight center line. And we're able to get a loose idea of what xylem might do, what this biological algorithm might do in other contexts. How could we apply that? Well, we're experimenting with designing design space, as I suggested, with creating a new approach to how we design things. Shown on the left, of course, much oversimplified, is the way we design things now. We make a stick figure sketch of something like a chair and then figure out how to make it, how to calibrate those legs and that seat. But what if we were able to design in a more hybrid way? Design the seat in a way that we knew that was fixed, but design the legs in a way where we're suggesting a field of possibilities, a design space, this red dashed line, and then allow the computer and biological algorithms to help us figure out new solutions that wouldn't have occurred to us otherwise. So how does this work? We basically create that, an algorithm, in this case loosely based on the xylem cell exoskeleton. We allow this algorithm to generate material, to deposit material in a number of different ways as the legs of a chair. We create this model so that we can create many, many different possible designs. For each design, we generate it, then we evaluate it, in this case, simulating it for structural performance, and then we evolve many, many designs. We use the computer for what it's good at, which is repeating boring automated tasks again and again and again. So this is just a small subset of the 100,000 designs we created of the chair, and now we're able to use some other techniques of computation developed in other fields, but very helpful for us as a designer to sort through this design space. Every data point equals a chair design, and we can look at different types of chair designs. We can monitor chair designs for qualities other than structure, apply our human judgment, and in the end, hopefully create objects that are then constrained for manufacturability, like with 3D printing. The bottom line here, represented in kind of the earliest proof of concept, is that if Model 1 is the way that we design today, or we've designed for hundreds of years, you create with existing known stock material like solid bars for a chair. Model 2 represents possibilities because of new manufacturing techniques like 3D printing. So you can take all those solid bars and make tiny lattices, tiny lattice structures instead of a solid bar, and you can get more or less equivalent structural performance with less weight. Model 3 represents what I think is the most exciting possibility, which is designs that are equally good performing. They perform as well as this kind of new manufacturing technique has suggested, but they represent a whole range of possibilities that wouldn't occur to us with our normal human linear way of thinking, that get us beyond our blind spots, that get us beyond our engineering rules of thumb, and therefore they help us be more creative. So we're using these tools of computation normally used or sometimes used for cold-blooded efficiency, but in this case we're using them for creativity. Okay, number 2, another thing we've been experimenting with in our recent practice is designing public interfaces. And this is basically an approach that involves bringing architecture to life, bringing our buildings and cities to life through dynamic forms and through layers of information and interactivity. What this means on a practical level is that we're creating a floating pier in the East River in New York City. You can see the Manhattan Bridge in the foreground, the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. This is one of our early prototypes for it. We're using technologies like the Internet of Things, digital sensors to sense things like water quality, presence of fish, and public interest in the environment, and then have this dynamic field of lights that changes color and blinks and glows according to information. But one of the things I want to note now that's affecting our recent practice is that we're combining these digital sensors, this Internet of Things layer in our cities, with biological sensors. And what you can see on the screen now is living mussels, the shellfish. They're opening and closing their shells. This is one of the things they do as they live. And it turns out that the rate and the amount that a mussel opens and closes its shell is a more sensitive and sophisticated measurement of water pollution than our best digital sensors. The great thing for me as a designer, if you glue a $2 Hall effect sensor on the shell of a magnet and on the shell of a mussel and a magnet on the other side, then you can capture this information. You can create a hybrid sensor that has the best of evolved biology over hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, the way a mussel detects water pollution, and you can combine that with a digital layer of information. you can combine, the age-old target of artificial intelligence, computers becoming smart, with what we should know and recognize is another form of intelligence, a biological intelligence or a natural intelligence. And this gives us the ability to create something like this, a kind of layer of information, a layer of light in the city that changes color, and it more than just reflecting a pretty pattern in the river like most of our urban lights, it gives us, it makes visible information that's normally invisible in our environment. This project will be under construction. What I showed before was a prototype for the project, and this project will be under construction early next year, commissioned by the City of New York to make this public interface to water quality right in Manhattan. And finally, number 3, the third approach we've been experimenting with is really about designing material ecosystems. And what I mean by this is thinking about materials and energies and flows in our built environment in new ways, thinking about the whole ecosystem, what goes into creating a building. And our hypothesis here in a project that we did for the Museum of Modern Art and MoMA PS1 this past summer, our hypothesis was that maybe we could redesign that material ecosystem and create a building, or at least a prototype of a building, with almost no waste, almost no energy required, and almost no carbon emissions. So this project was called Hi-Fi, and the basic idea was that we wanted to experiment with growing a new building component, growing a new lightweight, low-cost brick that is biodegradable, and at the end of the life of the building that you can compost and return to soil, return to the natural ecosystem. The way it works, the way we can do this is through this living organism here, called mycelium. This is the growing root-like structure of mushrooms that grows out in these tiny white filaments. And you can basically use this to grow building materials by taking the waste of agriculture, not the corn kernels, but the chopped up corn stalks, combine it with living mycelium, pack it into a mold of any shape, and then literally grow building blocks. This is about 5 days, a time lapse. It shows how these white filaments grow and bind together the agricultural waste. And then you can take these solid objects, these parts, out of the mold and use them for functional things. We've been working with a great startup company in upstate New York called EcoVative that has the facilities to do this. They had been making packaging material, and we went to them and said, hey, let's use this same process and make a new kind of brick. No one had done this before, so we had to do a lot of testing. Here you see one of our poor bricks undergoing 100,000 pounds of force. That's much more than it would ever have to withstand in a building, but this gives us a sense of its performance. We feed this information to our structural engineers at Arup, who are able to help us calculate the performance of this new building material, because you could probably note that there's no drop-down menu setting for mycelium bricks in the normal structural engineering software, so we have to do testing and figure out how to do this. In the end, we derived a brick shape like this that we invented and figured out how to layer it up in a normal load-bearing brick and mortar structure using some computation algorithms to help with the layout, and basically figure out how we could test out the viability of this new building material and this new approach by building something out in public, outdoors, for the first time at this scale. Everything about this project, the MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program project, is a little too much to bear, including a short design cycle, a short cycle where you have to figure out how to do it, a very short time period where you have to build it. But we wanted to really test out this new material in a public way in the courtyard of MoMA PS1. So we had about 4 weeks to build the structure. We used a kind of combination or a hybrid of Columbia graduate students in architecture and New York City brick masons. I should note everyone was paid on this job. Important to think about that aspect of the ecosystem. And in the end, created a 40-foot tall structure with 10,000 bricks that I think stands in an interesting contrast to the glass and steel buildings of Manhattan that you can see in the background, and the clay brick buildings of Queens, more in the foreground. It was important for us to test out the atmospheric qualities, the creative qualities of this material, in addition to the technical qualities. And we were interested in the way this material could play with light and shadow and texture and pattern. And of course, the ultimate test was every Saturday when 5,000 people came to see experimental electronic music and lived right with this architecture. So integrating a kind of a test of culture and society along with this new kind of building material experiment. In many ways, the project was designed to disappear as much as it was designed to appear, meaning that we composted the entire structure and returned it to earth at the end of the cycle. So we wanted to kind of demonstrate that you might be able to go from crops to construction to compost and back to crops in a healthy loop, as opposed to the way buildings are normally made with quite a bit of waste. Up to 40% of our landfills in this country are construction waste. So we still have a ways to go in exploring this type of ecosystem approach to design, but I wanted to share that approach as one thing that we think is very interesting in this new kind of hybrid digital biological domain. Thank you.
Great. Grace and Paul and the rest of the committee, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a very inspiring moment. Okay. So when Grace contacted me about today's roundtable discussion and event, I think that the main question was, how come that our practice is called open source architecture? I will discuss that, but to be fully honest, I think that For us, it was a little bit like a Dadaist exercise. We thought that it was an interesting name, so we picked it up and then started the whole question as to, what do you do with that? So I'm going to try to discuss that. So I decided to take this event today to do a certain exercise that is to question what is the nature of architectural knowledge today. And this is, in fact, a very different kind of lecture that I'm usually giving. So you're not going to see millions of projects, actually 3, and quickly. But I will try to frame them within that question of architectural knowledge. So the lecture, this paper is called Adaptive Knowledge because this is, in fact, the model that we are trying to develop at Open Source Architecture these days. I like to start with this kind of picture because I think that whenever we talk about technology, I think that we are talking about the human. For us, the human factor in all the projects we've been developing has always been a very important parameter. And so you see here myself and my 2 partners, Eran Neumann and Chandler Ahrens, and in the background you see our structural engineer from Arup, Judith Lepie, who we've been working with for a number of years on various research and development projects. So open source architecture was born in 2002 in Los Angeles as a node. We were then, the 3 of us, coming out from UCLA. A year later, it transformed into a vector with the opening of our branch in Tel Aviv. Then in 2006, it turned into a surface with projects in Paris and New York State. And since then, I would argue that open source has transformed into a field. It's a field of partnerships and collaborations with various research centers in North America, Europe, and Asia, as well as industries. And this movement from a node to a field, in fact, exemplifies the nature of information for our generation, its intensity and extensity. These notions represent a crucial aspect of our practice. So calling our practice open source architecture expressed our objective, that is to rethink the relation among disciplines, and more specifically, the search for a language that would bring our research, our design research, to act simultaneously at the core and at the edge of our discipline. So the ever-increasing role of technology in our perception of the world represented then an opportunity to envision a transdisciplinary activity in which multiple sources of expertise would intervene in the project in a non-hierarchical manner. The principle was to, in fact, use computation as a common language, to use computation to ultimately integrate and reflect the multiple sources of knowledge involved in the design process. And as I see here today, and also, I'm thinking about other practices, I think that we were definitely not the only one thinking in this direction. Now, since the creation of open source architecture, we have in fact witnessed the emergence of multiple discourses in architecture that refer to the notions of architectural performance, optimization, responsiveness, adaptability, etc., etc. I would argue that these terms have been often misused in our field. Yet what matters for our discussion today is the fact that these notions often refer to a deductive approach to knowledge, meaning the application of established models and theories to the building of hypotheses and finally so-called architectural solutions. On the other side of the architectural spectrum, we find architects who develop subtle forms and morphologies for the sake of producing architectural effects that are indeed increasingly sophisticated and beautiful. From the point of view of experimental knowledge, I would argue that this kind of approach is profoundly inductive in the sense that this kind of research stems from experimental observations on materials and forms while searching for general rules that would ultimately direct the architectural project. So I would like to propose the possibility to merge these 2 notions of deductive and inductive approaches into a third model that my partner and I are calling the adaptive approach. An adaptive approach selectively incorporates useful aspects of both deductive and inductive processes without solely relying on a single method. So what interests us at open source architecture are the consequences of such a model because it implies, and this is for me very important, it implies the possibility to think about architecture as a statistical system rather than an idealistic solution. It allows us to consider architecture both in terms of the image and the non-image of reality. And third, it brings us to consider the transdisciplinary nature of our disciplines. So I will illustrate these three notions of deductive, inductive, and adaptive knowledge across three projects at open source architecture. Now, interestingly enough, I realized that the first project is pretty much the very first project we ever did. The second one is one of the latest one, and the third one is in fact in process. So first, let's think about deductive knowledge. When we decided to put our projects under the banner of open source architecture, as mentioned, it meant for us that we wanted to promote a dialogue and a communication among disciplines. And at that time, we were then very much interested in 2006, we were very much interested with the notion of how to bring engineers and architects to collaborate and to communicate through the development of algorithms. So our first attempt to create such a dialogue led to a deductive approach to knowledge, meaning the building of an architecture that is based on the structuring of known theories. The project was called and is called the Helomorphic Project, and it was built in the context of the Genome exhibition at the MAK Center for the Arts and Architecture in West Hollywood. That is, in fact, an exhibition that took place in the famous Rudolf Schindler King's Road House. And for that exhibition, we invited a series of media artists and architects to, in fact, think about the relationship between architecture, the sciences, and technology almost a century after Rudolf Schindler. This project aimed to develop for the first time a full-scale structure using principles of topology optimization. And you see here the structure. Topology optimization is a principle in engineering. We basically collaborated here with Christina Shea, who's one of the instigator of this kind of research in the field of engineering, as well as Marina Gotovaya, a software developer. And basically what we started to do was to develop an interface together, looking into how we could bring together the architects and the engineering desires. In short, our goal was in fact to investigate the possibility for the machine to define, design, and even automatically manufacture the object while negotiating those different desires. And you see here the way we've been working, where on the top you see what I would call a non-image of architecture, the development of protocols that would allow us to dialogue or to communicate with the engineers. And on the bottom, with the kind of projects that, or the kind of morphologies that were coming up on our screens, and we were basically observing those phenomena on the screen. Now, what you see here is, in short, the courtyard of the Rudolf Schindler house that was transformed into a grid. We basically took the grid of the structure of the house, assigned to the different nodes structural capabilities and behaviors, and then basically the machine was started to really develop a whole range of possibilities, basically endless numbers of possibilities of or potentials for that structure. And you see here some of those 3D prints that we were then developing in order to better understand the behaviors of those algorithms that we were then developing. This is one of the possibilities that we decided to develop. And then, interestingly enough, what happens in our field is that whenever you want to build something, a response from a computer is not enough. You have to, in fact, produce working documents. You have to do prototypes in order to, in fact, be sure that both your liability and the liability of the engineer are not in danger while developing those kinds of full-scale structures. So we developed those prototypes. We had to test and prove to the municipality that the calculations of our machines were correct. We had to do all kinds of tests in wind tunnels, etc. And those prototypes are part of the FRAC collection in Orléans now. Another point that I find very interesting is that the whole project was about topology, about topological systems. And what is fascinating is that the more you develop topological systems, the more, in fact, you end up with typologies, as you can see down in the left side. Typologies, for instance, in this case, of joints. So I would say, and I would argue, that today it's all about topologies as well as typologies. You see here some of those working documents. Of course, I could give a whole lecture about this project, but just to show you a little bit about, this notion of the abstraction of the drawing in relation to the building of that kind of structure. The position of the different nodes on the site. And here, some testing of the structure at the UCLA Department of Mechanical Engineering. And on the right side, a manufacturing plant in Shanghai that actually produced the nodes. We actually quickly realized, at least at that time, that in America it was not possible, or nobody agreed to build or to manufacture 120 nodes that were all different. They could actually customize one and do it 10,000 times, but they would not do it 120 different nodes. But in China, they would do it. And so basically this is in fact in Shanghai where we develop the different nodes of the project, or the different joints of the structure. And here you see basically that structure in relation to the grid, or the modernist grid of the Rudolf Schindler House, and how basically with the use of those kinds of algorithms, we're moving from a three-dimensional grid to what I would argue is an n-dimensional grid of different parameters. A very different kind of project now. More recently, we completed the extension of a house. I'm not sure if this is going to work here. I know, okay. But, okay, you can see there in the center of the picture, we basically developed the extension of an existing house for a client in Culver City, California. And for this project, the client had only one request, and that was that the extension would be capable of collecting as much solar energy as possible, so that he could actually use it for its own use, but also so that he could sell it back to the grid. So a very, a very normal and standard story, I would say. So for this project, we basically started to manipulate the forms. We actually searched for different types of geometries. We were experimenting and observing, the different volumes that were produced, and we were in fact confronting that to, and you see here some of the physical models we're producing. We're confronting that to an energy analysis software package, and we started to, in fact, look how we could bridge the formal definition of the project with that kind of calculation and that kind of simulation of energy. And for us, it was actually pretty, pretty fascinating to do. It actually brought us to develop this crystal-like architecture. But for the sake of our discussion today, what I would argue was that this process, this entire process for this project, was in fact highly inductive in a way. In other words, we were developing a series of transformations of, we were searching for different types of forms, and we were then comparing those to, to that software, to that simulation software, thinking about or trying to recognize certain patterns, drawing some hypotheses as to what would be, let's say, a more ideal or more performant form, and then that brought us to develop that kind of theory as to what would be, the solution to follow. So, in fact, and you see here the project as it was built, but it is in fact during that process that I engaged in that discussion with my partners as to, what was exactly the type of model of knowledge we were going for. And in fact, I think that for me, this project was, of course, fascinating, but it's also a moment of crisis in a way, because you're thinking, okay, so I can do that. I can also do a project that is very different than this one, that is the helomorphic project that you've seen before, that was, after all, very deductive based, and deductive because it was based on mainly on technical aspects. And so we started to think about a third model, a model where basically we would be able to bring those different aspects within the design process itself. So this brought us to this, what I would call the adaptive transference of knowledge. And so here the idea is in fact to take axioms, theories, principles that are established and to confront them in a non-hierarchical manner to those other sides of what the architectural project is about, intuition, senses, and etc. So it was about bringing the image and the non-image of reality together. Now, to do this, of course, we had to go through a project that actually failed many years ago and that we used as a showcase for what would be such a method of design investigation. The project was actually a commission from a Swiss manufacturer to develop a line of furnitures. And our idea, and I'm talking about 5 years ago, our idea was to actually think how we could actually grow virtually a plant, and that plant would actually shape the furniture, the line of furniture. And you see here some of those examples that we were doing. We were actually fascinated by those geometries, how you have a series of points that are actually being attracted to another series of points and how the plant is growing. That actually brought us to this kind of sequence where you see on the left side a structure that is full of material and how we could actually take out as much material as possible, but by trying to keep the same kind of morphology or structural capability. A form of topology optimization, but from an architectural point of view. And of course, to do that, we actually used all kinds of principles, very simple principles in mathematics, k-means, binarization, etc., for those who knows what that is. But you see here some of those diagrams that we were producing in order to grow those plants in the computer. And you see here, for instance, the Eames chair, top left, the Eames chair with a lot of material, down right, the Eames chair, but this time with much less material, but with the same kind of structural efficiency. Some of those potentials that we were developing out of the growth of those plants in the computer. And we could even make that tree bloom in the machine. Yeah? So that was a limited edition of the chair. But what we realized then was that it was absolutely impossible to manufacture. It was absolutely impossible, and here again, we can discuss it later. It was impossible to bring that virtual model to the physical world. And so I thought that was actually fascinating. So this condition brought us to apply back a few years ago, as Grace, you mentioned, we applied for a Canadian Foundation for Innovation grant that would allow me to open the Life Lab at McGill University. That is, in fact, a pretty sophisticated computational and digital fabrication infrastructure where we're having engineers, architects, biologists, theorists, historians, software developers, and experts in robotics who are actually working together in the building of customized tools. And so in order to test this idea of an adaptive model, one that would bring together determinism and intuitionism, mathematics and the senses, I thought that it was important to build that kind of transdisciplinary lab where PhDs and postdocs and researchers in those various fields would actually get together and work together. And so 3 years ago, we actually received funds from what is called the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Councils of Canada. And you will see how it is interesting, is that we had to go to a source like that, to the social sciences, to get funding in order to start this project again, as a way to basically think about another culture of relationships and partnerships with the other disciplines. And the team that is developing this is an ongoing project. The team currently includes postdocs and professors in mechanical engineering who are experts in the field of topology optimization and, to make it more complex, in the field of topology optimization applied to lattice structures, to be clear, PhDs in architecture who are responsible for setting up innovative manufacturing processes, experts in material sciences, and industrial partners who are sharing with us their know-how in robotics. And the result is, in fact, an adaptive approach according to which the various sources of knowledge, and I'm trying to explain to you how it works in the lab, the various sources of knowledge are being identified in order to be able to integrate their expertise to the design process in a nonlinear fashion. In other words, when we are around the table, everyone knows what his or her own expertise. And it's important also, I think, as architects, that we think, what is our own expertise when we are within that kind of gathering. So instead of building an interface from scratch, as we've been doing before, we decided to investigate the possibility to, in fact, customize algorithms that would negotiate in between existing software packages that are being used respectively in those different disciplines. So the algorithms that we are developing right now are not specific to a discipline. They are built to communicate among software packages. And the objective here is, in fact, not to build the next Beam software, but instead to investigate the possibility to negotiate among those various sources of knowledge. So I'm just going to show you a few images of that ongoing project. So we are basically working on this chair again. The project is called EvoDevo. And the term is actually coming from biology because the type of algorithm that we are developing right now are very much inspired by the evolutionary development models in biology. You see here, for instance, some of the first experiments with topology optimization, how the form on the right is structurally viable, and how basically we can change the threshold so that with less and less material we can actually keep the same kind of structural consistency, except the last one, I believe. And then we started to think about the chair again, and you see here some of the simulations that we developed. We started to investigate again the chair, but from a very deductive approach at first. This is the Eames chair, in fact, back, but this time transformed into a bone. What you see here is, in fact, every voxel that you see on this chair, so every volume that you see here, is topologically connected to the rest of the system. So every pixel that you see here, in fact, is structurally defined in relation to its neighboring pixels as well as the rest of the system. So certainly we had those kinds of objects where you can test the atmospheric condition of the design as well as its relation to the mathematics and the intensive calculations. Here you see, for instance, some of the possibilities we are developing with our interface, so that by changing the forces on the matter, on the material, we can actually change the morphology of this chair. So it's about bringing together form, matter, and forces. Here, these are some of the most exciting part for me of this project, where you see by changing the forces and the anchor points of the chair, we can actually create different types of morphologies to choose from. And probably this is, for me, the best part. This is where, by changing the materials, we can actually completely change also the form of the chair. Now, what is for me fascinating here is the fact that it is virtual, but in fact now we're in the process of prototyping this project. And we are developing our own materials. This is a lattice structure that we are developing for the chair, where every node that you see here is structurally defined in relation to the rest of the system. And here in the lab, we are currently building this chair. I decided I'm not going to show you half of a chair. So in a few weeks from now, I'll be able and I'll be happy to communicate to you the full image of, of this chair and the way it looks like. It's actually, we have already a client for it. I will finish with this notion of the adaptive knowledge and this notion of bringing together mathematics and the senses, this notion of determinism and intuitionism, with a recent book that I co-edited with my friend Pablo Lorenzo Eroa from the Cooper Union. In this book, in fact, the reason why I'm showing it is because This discussion we had about adaptive knowledge is a discussion we had in the midst of a conference in 2010, Pablo, myself, and Shayau. And in fact, we decided to invite a series of historians, theorists, and practitioners to discuss their position in relation to this field that is commonly called digital architecture. That actually brought to this book, and in fact, the reason I'm showing you this is because what is fascinating when you start comparing those various discourses and projects in architecture today is in fact the multiplicity of positions. So the whole book, every chapter is actually introduced with a map that we have developed with a specialist in crowdsourcing, John Carpenter. And in fact, he took all the words and all the text and trying to see how basically we could start mapping those various projects and theories in relation to a much bigger picture that is the book itself. So I would like just to finish with a few questions that I don't really have an answer to, but I thought that it would be interesting for the debate that we will have. You know, as part of our open source culture, I'm actually wondering, first of all, what is the role and expertise of architects today, or how you would define that? What would be a pedagogical method that engages with such a transdisciplinary approach? I mean, I'm thinking about that because we're in school. And finally, what would be an economy of information in architecture today? Thank you very much.
Hey, you know, when Grace asked me to speak at this panel, she mentioned that it was my practice was far beyond the traditional, I think this kind of panel is really interesting because it gives you a chance rather than reiterating what you're doing exactly, really asking you to think about why you're doing what you're doing and how you're doing what you're doing. And I think for me, especially important because this project that I'm going to speak about, I'm only going to speak about one project, is one that is, for me, really new and outside of my comfort zone. It's really my first true curatorial experience. And so how does one approach something that you've never done before? And at least for me, it was an opportunity. Well, the way I approached it was by thinking about, okay, what have I done? What do I do? And how could I approach curating architecture from what I do know, which is being, one, a critic, a researcher, editor, which I do with Praxis, and then more distantly, my work as a practicing architect. And so really those two things, and I never really thought about it exactly until Grace asked me to think about this, but that's really what has formed Office US and the two parts of the Office US project. The project is the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale this year, and the core part of the project really combines a repository archive and an on-site working office. So a little bit about the origins of the project. When Anna Miliaki and Eva Frank and I decided to collaborate on this proposal, what we decided we wanted to do was to respond to Koolhaas's claim that the processes of modernity have created and this is a quote, a global ubiquity of material and style. And we wanted to, respond to that, which is kind of a strangely almost romantic and nostalgic position when you think, 1998, he's saying fuck context, and now he's kind of lamenting this ubiquity of style. But that's another topic. But in any case, we wanted to respond to that by acknowledging the US's complicity, if not primary perpetration in that condition. And we wanted to do that by looking at the modernization of the architectural office, arguably for us what the kind of the primary, what the US has contributed to modernism in architecture. So what we really thought we would look at is that kind of development of professionalized practice and the evolution from loosely 1914 of the office from being an atelier, although there's certainly exceptions to that rule, but the evolution from atelier to corporation in the mid-century to now, where you have these kind of multinational conglomerates. And looking really then also, if you look at the fundamentals, one of our discussion said, well, of all these fundamentals, what are the things that are producing the fundamental? And the kind of fundamental really is the office. So initially, when we discussed this, we imagined exhibiting works that were designed by U.S. firms and built globally. So our kind of criteria was any project built by a U.S. firm abroad on foreign soil. And when you start just thinking about that in the abstract, of course, we imagined it would be the US Pavilion would be filled with projects by firms like HOK, SOM, KPF, all the big three letters. And we would invite, again, this is our initial idea, but that we would invite younger firms, less corporate, to propose alternatives. But as we began to look more deeply into those US firms and really doing the research, the picture really became much more interesting and much more complicated. There were, from 1914, there were firms like Marion Maney and Walter Burley Griffin who had come out of Frank Lloyd Wright's office, won the Canberra competition. They were like interns basically in his office. They proposed the new capital for Australia, won the competition, and went out to Australia to build work out there, did some work, grew a firm quite large, but then the Depression hit and they ended up building incinerators, which were really fascinating. But then, so, from them to stories of, some of SOM's work mid-century, the building of the Hilton hotels post-war, and then to younger firms today, like David even, or Howler Yoon, who are working in Asia. So as I said, it was a much more diverse story than we imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So this is one of the first images we made for the project, which combines our logo, which was designed by Natasha Jens with Pentagram, with a historical photo of the US Pavilion in Venice. The US Pavilion in Venice itself fell into our criteria of a project built abroad by the then hot firm of Delano and Aldrich. Delano and Aldrich were like real competitors with McKim, Mead and White at the time. And the logo is comprised of two of the most like ubiquitous and common fonts, the ones that are on everybody's operating system, Arial and Times New Roman. And so it became for us a kind of a way of thinking about kind of the normative office, but also the office, or also the kind of history and future brought together all in this kind of one image for us. It also begins to suggest to the important part for us is really the conflating of the space of exhibition and the space of production so that it could sort of operate simultaneously as this repository of historical ideas and historical projects, as well as an office. So the last thing that I think was really exciting to us about this as an idea is usually you go to the opening of the Biennale and the projects are as good as they're going to be. The opening, in a way, is the closing of the project. And for us, it was really exciting to imagine the opening really being an opening and being something that would evolve over 6 months, which it has. Every office needs a project, and for us that project was the reimagining and reactivating of this historical baggage of the repository or archive of US work abroad over the last 100 years. And so this is sort of my work as sort of researcher and editor coming in here. We had an open call for projects to be submitted for the repository, but we also used an extensive research team of over 20 graduate students at MIT and 10 at OSU. By February, we found out we got the commission in, I guess it was September basically. And by February, we had a database of almost 2,400 projects and about 200 firms. And while I won't say that 2,400 was 100% comprehensive, it was solid. We limited that to architectural firms, so A&E firms, if they were primarily engineering, didn't count. The built work, it had to be built work because we were interested in the agency of this work abroad. We wouldn't allow for houses or interiors, again, because we felt like what was important about this export of American architecture was that it had some public presence. We had to, just to be able to fit it into the pavilion, we had to edit into about half of that. We tried to do it representative typologies, geographies, and firms, so that there's a kind of representative distribution of material. And at the same time, we're doing that, and we're working with Liang to design the office space itself. This place that we really imagined, and I think has begun to test new protocols for the contemporary office. So this is Liang's plan for the pavilion. We worked with them to define, of course, Anna, Eva, and I are all architects, so we had way too many architects working and thinking through this project. But some of the important things were that the office space itself had to be able to expand and evolve. Of course, it had to be able to house the archive as well, which ends up on the, so the archive ends up on these kind of outside walls with the office kind of sitting in the middle of it. And increasingly, the way these two things began to feed back and forth with each other is as we're doing the research for the repository, we're collecting images of these historical offices. And what's so interesting about them is so many of them are dominated by the table. And so at some point that research then fed into the way we began to think about the office itself on site. It would have to be dominated by the table. Here's a kind of diagram of our aspiration for that table. It became really prominent too, I would say, in the kind of dark days of last February when fundraising was bleak, because the US government gives you about between an eighth and a tenth of what you need to actually put this on, so we were fundraising at the same time. Projecting and hoping the money is going to come in, but not sure it is. And at one point I just said to Chris and Dominic, I was like, okay, if we have to, the entire exhibition can just be the table if necessary. Let's just make it the most amazing table and put everything in there. And that table can become this multi-purpose site for work, play, and display. So this is what they came back with. So this modular table, as I said, is configurable, and all those little blue things are, is this not working? No. All the blue foam is, these ideas of model, or they're models, they're the tools for the office. A really quick mini tour. So here we are at the opening. Myself, Anna, Eva, and 8 partners who were selected from an open call who are working on site still. It is a working office. We decided instead, as the idea evolved and as we realized that some of the young firms that we wanted to propose alternatives were actually in the archive themselves, we decided we'd just form our own firm with 8 partners. These people were selected from an open call of over 100 entries, and they're collaborating with 90 outpost offices from around the world. We thought we'd just form our own firm of Office US, people who could actually be there and working with the repository as their kind of historical baggage through a series of 25 contemporary issues that kind of are teased out of or reflect attitudes about the historical archive. The courtyard serves as the conference room for the partners, but also for the Biennale. And we took this sort of the louvers on the facade, both to kind of change the scale slightly, of course, to also deny the front entrance. One of the really difficult things about this building is It's got this kind of central entry, which creates the no return problem twice because of the symmetry. So we decided to kind of deny that central entry through this, through the louvers, and then to also change the scale of that and give it a kind of interior feel. This is a quick tour. Welcome to Office US. This is the first room, which is a reception room with a couple of workstations, the repository on the left. The repository is organized in a relentlessly chronological order. That was the only thing that counted, was chronology, which produces some interesting conditions, which I'll show in a minute. But the binders serve as that kind of program for the office. This is the second workstation, second room with 2 workstations. The door to the left is this kind of central rotunda that you saw, which we decided in our research. There was a recent Wall Street Journal article that said that 80% of young professionals in New York work in bed. So we decided to create a bedroom, and that thing in the middle is actually a foam, so it's this sort of soft stone in the middle of it. The scale works, the scale of this, what would have been an entry space, really is quite odd, but it works nicely as a bedroom. And it has this kind of calm and isolated sense, despite this, the kind of reflections that are, it's both centrally overload and deprivation at the same time. It creates a real sort of oasis in the middle of the office. This is the kind of expanded surface where you can see there's places for pens and books and all kinds of materials the office is using, their tools. A little bit more about the repository, which is constructed through these series of binders. Each binder is open source. It can expand with separate front and back covers to accommodate 8 pages or 600 pages, which is the SOM binder. So they can be added, and also so they can be added to over the course of the Biennale. This is a typical office binder cover. Something happened to my slides in the translation. Sorry about that. All the frames around them are missing. Each binder, so this is an office binder. So offices, the founding of an office is treated the same as the commissioning of a project. This is an office binder. Each binder has a written description and a fact sheet. The O tab is the operations tab. That's taken from AIA nomenclature. This is my office coming in, my practicing architect coming in. These are images of the partners' plans and other images of the office for each project. And then what we call resources, which is historical journal articles of how the offices were portrayed in the architectural press, everything from, pretty banal stuff like the brick builder, which talks about the business, the sort of the business aspect of McKim Mead & White's work, to something like, and these are kind of great too, when you begin to scan all of this, you get this wonderful texture of ads of the time. But you get Peter Smithson's The Fine and the Folk, where he aligns McKim, Mead & White with SOM for their detailing and material, which I think is a really interesting read of their work. I mean, that one part of this, this research allowed us to uncover all kinds of really interesting material that isn't kind of conventionally in the canon, but still, I think is really an interesting way of reading some of this, all of this work, really. But the Peter Smithson, when he begins to put together McKim, Mead & White and SOM, and I think really interestingly, looking beyond the kind of stylistic nature of their work, he says, because of the detail and material, which I love this quote, that what they share in common is that special tradition of concentration on detail, which Americans enjoy, that arouse cargo cult feelings in foreigners. So this full binder, this is just an excerpt, is 80 pages. This is a typical project binder. This is the SOM's post-war Istanbul Hilton Hotel, built with Marshall Plan money. So Conrad Hilton was in absolutely no risk of losing his investment. And he has this intention of building a series of what he calls Little Americas,
around the world in places which are sort of sensitive to create these kind of outposts that both allow people from the US to travel with little risk, but also that kind of create these outposts of democracy to allow the communist world to see how the better half lives. I mean, those are quotes from Conrad Hilton, not from me. I mean, and I think what I hope this also helps project is that, you know, I'm not really sure exactly how the State Department feels about this, because by no means are we saying that this is a really fantastic thing. You know, this comes with all of its baggage and all of its problems. I mean, some of it is interesting, but many of the projects, and not just the projects themselves, but what we were trying to do was open up this kind of larger context, which we don't usually think about in architecture school. Like, what are those things that really make so many of these deeply problematic? So again, with the project binder, you get the A tab, the architectural tab, instead of the O tab. But same thing, you get the projects. We worked with firms. Oftentimes, if a firm was still around, we were contacting them directly to get project information. And if not, we were going to archives. And so here you get, again, this was a quite long binder, but some idea you get in the architectural section, plans sections, and project information, and then the resources, which is how it's been seen in the architectural press. I think one of the really interesting things about this project too, and one of the problematic issues of it is the development of the dual elevator course, so that, again, the people from the US can come in and have their hamburgers and milkshakes and be serviced by the local people who they never really have to interact with. The relentless chronology was fascinating. Once, we honestly, we got them all there in Venice, and we just started putting them out. Actually, we had to assemble them on site. There was about a month of work there with a group of students from OSU. But there's these really strange juxtapositions, like John Portman and John Haydock founding their offices in the same year. I don't think their names have ever been said in the same sentence before, but not in architectural circles. But, it functions as a library at the small scale for a visitor who wants to spend some time. I think one of the critiques of this exhibition overall, not just ours, I mean the whole Biennale, was that it was too much information. That's Sylvia Lavin. And I would agree, and that was why for us it was really important to balance this with the office on site. And we were really quite aware that this as much as anything, this repository is for the people working there, but also for any visitor who really does want to sit down and spend some time, and some do. But it also works, I think, really well for the casual visitor who doesn't pick up a single book. You begin to see trends, and you can begin to read really interesting, so for example, this first room, which is a fourth of the exhibition, you get 1914 to 1952. So yes, I guess we kind of all know that there's a lot more built work abroad now than there was, but this makes it really palpable. There's also shifts in representational styles, shifts in typologies. After the war, you get a whole bunch of embassies, and you get those wonderful Esto perspective correction photographs that makes the grids even more gridded feeling. And then as you get into the third room, the chroma shifts to blue as all of a sudden everybody wants a skyscraper, and you're getting these real object buildings. There's a kind of whole reading that just reads at really just at the scale of the cover. Yet still, we wanted to make a series about a week before, because I felt like we had about 4 days before the opening, and all the binders were up, and there was a little bit of time on my hands, and I was nervous. We decided to make a series of guides that allow you to traverse the repository by country, by firm, and typology. And again, it was kind of leftover time, but also a means to be able to communicate to people who came into the pavilion. Like, okay, truth be known, I had a fear that somebody from SOM would walk in and say, "Where are my projects?" And I wouldn't know, and I figured if I had the guide, I could go to it. So we did this, and what emerged was kind of amazing. So in some cases, at least. So SOM, you get, this is a kind of map of the wall, and you get a kind of relatively even distribution, you know, a cluster post-war. But things like South Korea. So South Korea, nothing until 1992 with Kim Young-san's presidency, which is the first sort of non-militarized government in South Korea. United Kingdom, you know, you look at this and you're like, oh, what's going on? Oh, right, the 80s is when the World Banking headquarters moves to the United Kingdom. Saudi Arabia, okay, you get, you know, the oil money in the 70s, and then kind of nothing, and then, you know, a couple of towers more recently. China, now everybody's building in China, right? I mean, another thing, another layer in this, which this works, is you can begin to see we use the logo of the firm to brand the covers of them, hoping that would begin to allow you to kind of wayfinding. And in many cases, I think it works pretty well. But again, you begin to see everybody here building in China, AECOM, Shop, Obra, Bob Stern, Richard Meyer, Stephen Hall, everybody. And again, that's a kind of trajectory, the few philanthropic projects in the beginning and the more recent work. Back to the office real quickly. The office is launched really at this conference table at the opening. It's been a really active space with weekly workshops. This is some of the work that's being done in the pavilion in October. The sound that you hear is some of the soundtracks. They're producing a soundtrack every week, the kind of muzak of the office. This particular one was for the in conjunction with a radio show that they did with a Los Angeles radio station. So it was an interview, but this is kind of Venice to Venice, and they're overlaying the kind of parallel Venices here in sound. The work being done in the background is work on embassy walls. That half of the space was entirely white or empty when we opened, which made one of my co-curators, who will remain anonymous, but those of you who know us will probably be able to figure it out, but it made her very, very nervous to have a white wall. But it's been amazing open space for the partners to inhabit. This is some of the work they've been doing. This is the entry to the Guggenheim Helsinki competition, which really began as a website with the idea of proposing reprogramming a conventional cruise ship into a mobile museum and a cultural free port that traverses the tax-free space between Helsinki, Tallinn, and St. Petersburg. This is the Helsinki docking terminal with this kind of wall that separates the two scales. I mean, this is a workshop on anger-love management, which was really looking at embassies. That was done with Caroline O'Donnell in my studio this fall. Aaron Betsky came and spoke with us. He works for the office, Overseas Building Office. He's a consultant for them, so he's kind of an expert on the Design Embassy program. And there's, you know, a series of charrettes that have been done there too. This is the latest project that they've done, and I particularly enamored with it because the group there is really kind of finding their groove. And you know, in 3 weeks it's going to close. But this is a proposal that they just submitted for them to curate the Oslo Architectural Triennale. And what they're doing here is, just as we began to kind of question the office, they want to turn it back and look at the academy. So this is the University of Bad Ideas, and they want to look into the production of our alternative educational experiments and sort of turning that trope over on itself. They're proposing a kind of 2-year academic program. And they've decided, you know, we had a lot of conversations about this, but they're transforming the name from Office US to Office OS, which I'm super happy about, in that it's, you know, the idea that this has then launched this new firm that actually is really interested in going and moving on. But a little sad because only because the US also had the double entendre of us. And the other important aspect, I think, for us was really imagining this as a means and or kind of an experiment in a kind of different architectural creativity. You know, how could we imagine transforming the office into this kind of really inclusive environment? You know, if we do believe in, you know, 10 years ago, nobody believed much in Wiki. It was all kind of scoffed at, and today we now will accept that as a kind of model of creativity that's, or creative thought and intelligence that's greater than the sum of its parts. And I'm not going to say that Office US got there yet, but the idea that we would put that idea on the table, I think, is really what one of the important aspects of this project. And so I guess Office OS does that, but it loses the kind of collectivity. But I'm excited to see them move on. So thanks.
So we have a pretty big challenge in our time because every single person got longer. But I would like to invite the panelists to come. Again, there's so much to talk about, and it's going to be challenging for us to do it. But Paul, if we could and what we might actually do is Paul and I might actually shorten our commentary so that we can also open it up to you guys very directly, because I know that that's something that we really want to encourage, this conversation between our panelists.
Yeah, is this working? Jay, what do you think? Should we merge all of them? One firm? It's really overwhelming, I think, to try to summarize it. Can I just get a quick show of hands? Who has a question? Anyone? Okay. Okay. Yeah, because we want to make sure that people who have questions, we have 9 minutes. We promise to get you kind of out here on time. I guess if I start talking, I'm going to run another 50 minutes. So the whole thing is, why don't we start with questions, and then if I can do other things if people don't have questions. Can we? Shall we start with me? Yeah, let's start with questions, because I'm super interested in what your reactions.
This is a question for Aaron. I went to Casey Reese's talk with Arcadia recently, and he was producing the stuff he produces, amazing. But I asked him this question: how did he decide? I mean, first of all, when does he stop the processing, right? Then how does he decide between them? And I said, is it just simply based on aesthetics and what looks good? And he said, yeah. Which strikes me as being a kind of cop-out. It's not really truly computational, if that's the situation. I've also worked with Casey, with Christina Shi and with Spila Budechnik, who was teaching here, on an iForm project. And we were in the same situation. You kind of produce all these possibles, and incidentally, they're not optimizations at all. But anyway, we produce all this array of possibles, and you choose them according to what looks good. So my question to you is are you ever going to get to the situation where you are totally deductive in any process, or are we always constrained by aesthetics? It has to look good. Whatever we produce, including that nice house you did, we judge it based on how good it is.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. This is I think it's a crucial question, and in fact, it calls also to define what would be the nature of architectural representation today, or the model and the status of the model in architecture today. I remember asking the same question to Greg Lin, who was then one of my teachers, and to the idea of iterations, he would say, well, if I could build all of them, I would just build all of them. He just liked all of them. I think that, in fact, what we are trying to do now with this notion of the adaptive knowledge is to, in fact, be able to build an extra layer of information or decision on, where do we stop with those experiments in terms of topology optimization? Because, as you know, it produces limitless possibilities and potentials depending on the way those algorithms are being organized, of course. Now, what happens in the project of the chair that we are developing right now is that we brought in, speaking about that notion of deductive and inductive approach in architecture, we brought in the notion of fabrication constraints. Because of course the whole experiment started with that project that failed because we couldn't produce it, we couldn't manufacture it. So bringing this notion in fact, allows us, in fact, to make certain decisions as to, what would be a potential solution that would be more adapted for fabrication and for manufacturing. So this is how, we are trying to bring those various aspects literally directly within the design process, not as a sequence, because of course we hear, and I hear that very much, oh, don't worry, we're going to 3D print those things. I mean, it just simply doesn't work that way. I think that they are, in the physical world has certain constraints that the virtual world doesn't, and in fact it is about bringing those two, or bridging those two realms together. So for us, one of the methods of where do we stop is based on those kinds of other factors. But I would argue also that beauty is very important.
Next question in the back. Can you?
Hi. Yeah, my question is for the living. I'm just curious. Is that funny? What are the applications you see for a biodegradable brick outside of an art installation or, say, a blockbuster video?
No, it's a good question. There are a couple of ways to answer that. One is this was the first time the material had been used in an outdoor large-scale installation. So we did learn a lot from this installation. We hope that this installation will teach us about some other possible applications. Another way to answer the question, kind of comes full circle to what I described as this approach combining architecture and biology. And the biologists that I'm working with have reminded me that we can dial in whatever we want out of this material. So in other words, kind of an oversimplification, but we can make a 2-week version, a 2-month version, a 2-year version, a 20-year version of this exact same material by manipulating the environment, the growing conditions of this living organism, and even eventually the genes of this living organism to tune them to get the performance we want. And that's what to me is exciting, that it opens up this world of possibilities that seems of a different nature and possibly a wider world of possibilities than chemical materials. So what are the applications? Well, I think there are lots of them. Some immediate ones are ceiling tiles. It's not outdoor rated, but this material has great acoustic dampening properties. It could immediately drop into existing building culture. Insulation, a replacement to all rigid foam insulation with a biodegradable material, a material that has no toxic chemicals. So there's a range of possibilities.
I actually have a related question, but not specifically about the brick, but I'm just curious, everybody wanted, when I was talking about this with the students, they all wanted to know, what does it mean that you've been purchased by Autodesk? Talk to us about that. We all want to know. And the committee said, I want to be purchased by Autodesk. What does that mean? What does that mean for us?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Like the brick, we don't totally know. It's an experiment. For people who don't know, my small architecture firm was recently acquired by the large software company Autodesk. And to my knowledge, it's the first transaction of its kind in that way. Of course, small architecture firms get bought by large architecture firms a lot, and there's even some bleeding into engineering there. It's the first time a small architecture firm has been bought by a tech company. we don't really know, but the exciting thing for me is that the loose agreement, of course, followed by an 80-page legal document, but the loose agreement was that we will, from my point of view, we'll do everything we're doing now, but kind of supercharge it. So we're going to keep our projects, our clients, our autonomy, our name, our shared working space in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with mismatched chairs. We'll keep our design culture, our mode of operation, but we'll gain increased resources, connections to technologies, connections to business partners and universities. And I think it's, so that's the stuff I know, and so far it's been going well, and we're being the living better.
Come on, really? That's it?
But
I actually like to weigh in on that one, because in actuality, practice doesn't exist in a vacuum. We are partners with industry and with a system of economy, and so there's a tension between existing economic structures and value chains, which in developed countries are extremely long, right? I mean, the issue of steel manufacture from mining to getting an I-beam out of it represents a whole value stream that society values, and so that interacts with a profession that is also established. So are we developing form, or at some point does the industrial chain start to inform what we can do, right? And so things like what I see you gentlemen doing is kind of disrupting this comfortable kind of economic thing with another economy, which is the economy of innovation, which sometimes doesn't follow the script of entrenched interests in terms of the economy, but really postulates a different chain that's possible. So I think that the smart thing about Autodesk is they recognize that. And they want to be, they want to buy the next disruptor in terms of this comfortable kind of economic constellation that we understand is going to change because of the issue of climate change, environmental issues, of human agriculture and all these other things that are out there that probably weren't in the forefront of our minds as a society 100 years ago. And I think listening to everyone here reminds me of how 20th century I am in some of my mindset. But I think that this is the turning point of the tension between an economy of innovation and one of entrenched economic, kind of value chains that really have turned architecture into a service business, right? Where the service menu kind of drives the practice, rather than this other way around in terms of the value of innovation driving practice. And it's a very interesting thing, and perhaps some of your documentation would inform how that's evolved in US practice over time, no?
Well, I mean, actually, I would say in the projects that we were looking at,
right,
for the most part, they're not conventionally innovative practice.
Right, but what I'm saying is that it's the value chain driving practice rather than the other way around.
Absolutely.
And some of the thing of the Biennale is the retrospective aspect of it is this kind of retrospective documentation of the formation of that value chain from the 19th century and its domination of our own understanding of practice going forward. So in a way, this is the moment for creative disruption. So, yes, sir.
Okay, I have a question for David and Aaron. But I'd like to use Elena's distinction between discipline and profession. And I think it describes this pattern where you have a sort of vital moment and then a mechanical persistence that sort of feeds off of that. But I think in both of your presentations, David and Aaron, you were sort of using a similar movement. In the case of the chair that you presented, David, there's sort of the idea of this formula, and then the sort of mechanical persistence of it is sort of handled through computation. and there are sort of similar examples that you were talking about with these optimization examples. And I'm wondering if you would sort of subscribe to the aspiration, if we use the distinction discipline, profession, the aspiration to actually sort of automate through computation the professional or the profession moment of that translation from a vital moment to a sort of mechanical persistence. So you have something like a pure discipline.
I don't know if this is exactly answering what you're asking, but I'm most interested in the hybrid moments. I mean, so the way that we can, sure, use the computer to automate things and you know, do the chugging along to figure out things that we want to know, but also remembering that every algorithm has a lot of assumptions, that we program in those assumptions or someone else does, and that you know, we have to kind of coach out of the system what we want to get out of it. So, you know, just like in the bricks, I'm interested in this kind of hybrid digital biological thing. I think in the design process, I talk about a formula, but I'm interested, you know, in terms of an actual equation that you can plug in variables to. But I'm interested in this kind of cooperative ecosystem between the human and the computer. And so I think there's no like macro formula for that I'm interested in. I'm more interested in the way that, you know, I hate to use the word, but parametric models can expose assumptions and foster debate and force you to talk about values and make decisions rather than like producing a type of thing that we always know we want because it was created by this one algorithm.
I think that I mean, I really appreciate your question and statement, because I think that what I found fascinating today in the discussion we had and in the presentations was always this question about, you know, what is the expertise of the architect today? And I think that that's a real question that needs to be asked, because that notion of, you know, the disciplines versus the profession, or the discipline and the profession, I think that it questioned that, you know, what is the nature of our work today? And you know, I was fascinated, you know, to see those walls of copies in the US Pavilion, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, like, you know, I was trained as an architect, so, you know, I can really appreciate it, but you know, there is a certain friction between this and, you know, what I've seen from Elena today and from David, in the sense that obviously architects today are capable of integrating other disciplines as well as bringing other disciplines within the field of architecture. I like to use a term that Paul has used before we started the whole discussion today, the term of porosity. I think that the fact that our discipline would be porous to those other fields of knowledge, I think is very interesting. It is really a question that I would ask, and that is, you know, how would you define the role of the architects today within those transdisciplinary practices? And just to finish on this, there is one thing I would like just to be very clear about. In universities, we often hear the terms multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, etc. Although it doesn't really work, because everyone likes to be in his or her own field, because it's a kind of a comfort zone. But I use the term transdisciplinarity because I insist on the fact that as an architect, when I'm around the table with engineers and others, I would like to be recognized as an architect, not as a pseudo-engineer or a pseudo-biologist, etc. So I think that there is really a necessity for us to claim our expertise within those kinds of larger groups when we are developing our projects.
Can I just follow up to one thing? You know, I've been kind of having watched your 3 presentations and then about to give mine, thinking, what do we really have in common here? And I think actually it is that we're all like we're all designing something I was designing an office, you know, and we're all designing these things that we actually have not exact. I mean, you know, you're doing the mold, I'm doing people, right? It's like, we weren't sure how this thing is going to play out over the next, you know, when we started it 6 months ago, it could have been a colossal failure. And, you know, you kind of work with this experimental, and I think all of us are working with these kind of things that are slightly beyond our control, which is a very different model than the stuff that was lining all those books on the walls, right? Those were all very much, well, maybe not in the last room, with some of the work of people in here, for example, but I think in those first couple of rooms, I mean, that was like, they knew what they were building, right? It was a very clear thing. And I think what maybe we share is that kind of constructing of this thing and letting it run a bit with the not exactly being entirely certain of what that outcome is going to be.
But part of it comes from having a shift from being basically driven by a political project or a social project or even an economic one where you're trying to build capitalism or you're trying to build, right? So I think a lot of the nation building activity of Western countries during the 19th century has come to a conclusion, whether they like it or not. And so I think we're on to a different kind of gestalt about like what our role should be. So a lot of the kind of that representation of state authority and all those things, it's kind of over, right? So I mean, in the vacuum of the political project, the social project, the project of developing capitalism or other things, there's a vacuum to be explored. And I think all of your work, in one way or another, it kind of addresses different aspects of that vacuum. So
I think maybe the word politics has been associated with one understanding of a social project, whereas I think nowadays the idea of politics is much more linked to the idea of global culture.
right.
And there is no one fixed culture that can embrace the multiplicity of reality.
Right.
And in a way, I think even the compositional problem of architecture has a multifaceted quality of global culture. So that's when we see this incredible amount of data, which I think is simply a new aesthetic that comprehends composition in a much more complex way. We are now used to understand multiplicity in aesthetic, which before maybe was not the case. If the rules of composition were symmetry, composition of multiple volumes, now we're used to look at thousands of pieces and their parametric design somehow enters the realm of architecture. I'm not sure that the word politics doesn't apply anymore. I just think that word the politics became much wider, and I think the aesthetic project is a political project in many ways.
Yes. But it's curious that when you said public imagination,
Yeah.
I was thinking public order. So you know, it's 19th, 20th century is the architect's public order, and you're thinking public imagination, and I'm going like, that's why I'm 19th century. You know.
I wanted to make that distinction between
Right.
the politics of the discipline and the politics of the practice and the profession,
Right.
because I think they're very different.
Absolutely.
And I do think that the aesthetic project is an important one, is political as much as others. And actually, they could combine, and there are moments where they combine, and these are very lucky moments. And I would not imagine one architect being a disciplined architect necessarily, but some of their work to be a disciplined piece of architecture, which are very rare, actually.
Pierre had a question.
So, question about research. Ironically, as part of this practice platform, you spend a lot of time speaking about research, your own research, and how, to a certain extent, it drives practice in a lot of different ways. And I'm just wondering if we sort of like feed that back into the loop of the university and professional programs, how do you see pedagogical models needing to change and understanding how research needs to be part of professional training? Because one can argue, and I'm going to sound 18th century here, that professional programs have essentially been delivery mechanisms for the profession, right? And we're now at a point, right at this moment, where that system is broken. And I mean, you're pretty much evidence of the fact that you're inventing it through research. And so if you had an opportunity, hypothetically, of kicking back on the pedagogy or pedagogical models, how do you see research having to kind of like kick back on sort of old site-based driven approach in design? It's an open question.
My sense is that every school has to edit their own program, whether or not they do it consciously. 3, 4, 5 years are never enough to teach all of it. Architecture is a very complex profession. I think we all know that. The practice is so complex. And I think there are schools that make a conscious decision of understanding discipline as being the core of what you have to teach. And then there are other schools that understand profession as being the core of what you teach. And I think at the end, I think you need to understand what you imagine to be the most useful thing for the students, which is what is that you can learn only in school and that you cannot learn necessarily afterwards. That's the kind of question I ask myself when I think of the curriculum. And I think teaching discipline is something that probably is very hard to learn afterwards, teaching that language, aesthetic language, whereas probably the profession is something that very much is taken care of by your work experience and the licensing exams and all those kind of things that actually happen afterwards. So I think that research somewhat needs to be folded into this idea of discipline in schools in general. And the schools that I think are doing the best kind of design are the ones that make a conscious choice in where to invest their energy in that way.
I really like your comment, Pierre. I think that it's definitely one of the big challenges that we are facing today in academia. But I think that also it depends on the structure of the universities that we're talking about, because I think that the condition at SCI-Arc is very different at McGill University, as you can imagine. For McGill, the advantage that we have, of course, is to have a PhD program where the students can actually integrate the research of faculties and other researchers in order to develop a project. But I would like to approach your question from a different side. I think that in the past years, and I'm thinking because some of my former students are here, one of the things that I was always fascinated about was the design studio and the way the design studio is evolving in the schools of architecture, landscape design, etc. Because I think that the design studio environment really reflects what's happening within the discipline. And so I recently at McGill University implemented a new kind of design studio that I think is, in fact, working pretty well, where I'm actually teaching the design studio with a colleague of mine that is also a dear friend, and he's a historian, Martin Bressani. He's a historian and theorist, primarily, and I'm more of a practitioner and designer / technologist. And in fact, the idea that he would bring his own research interest and I would bring my own research interest, and we would actually use that as a way to create a dialogue between different practices in architecture is, I think, something that became extremely positive among the students. Because suddenly the design studio was not anymore just about designing in the professional program I'm talking about, yeah? But it started to also get those other aspects. In the case of Martin, it's a fascination for the notion of the atmospheric in architecture. In my case, it's the notion of morphogenetics. And so bringing those different aspects together within the studio context, I think was maybe a way or a certain method pedagogically to in fact trigger a different kind of discussion within the design studio. So you see, I'm very pragmatic in my answer, but I think that that's how we should maybe try to open our own curriculum so that we could integrate those different or those other aspects and be selective about them even, so that you can develop an agenda in terms of research.
Okay, so we could talk for several more hours, but we're out of time, and I realize some of you would need to leave. So Grace, you want to end the panel, and unless our one last question. Is there one, Scott?
I have many questions for many people, but limited to one. Benjamin, I'm going to try to limit it to one, although I'd like to ask you about 20. One comes to mind. You said you were looking for the applications. You began to discover what they would be, perhaps ceilings. You spoke that way, and then I was thinking about the installations temporary, and so the disillusion or the return to nature of the project was necessitated by the programmatic
circumstance of PS1. It strikes me that PS1, with the work installation from I don't know how many years ago by Amal and Dan, a similar kind of proposition, is made in such a way as to, let's say, introduce the question of temporariness, and it's quite compatible with your project. It's a very fitting and correct site for what you did. But you didn't really answer very well the question, because it seems to me perhaps you're suggesting that the only application it could have would be for temporary installations or temporary aspects of architecture. It would leave behind the infrastructure, all of the infrastructure, for example, that's recorded by Ashley, that is accounted for in her exhibition, would be left intact. The status quo of architectural production would remain. The only thing that would change are the fittings, the surfaces, the ephemera that has always been that way. I mean, if you look at the 20th century, so many buildings have been made of cladding that has been shorn and replaced and comes and goes. This is just the latest iteration of that. And all of that waste from construction will proceed to be produced for the production of the large-scale works, for the frameworks in which your temporary and ephemeral things will apply themselves, to which they will be applied, sorry. So you see, it leaves the status quo of the production of architecture alone. That's what concerns me. I don't see how it could possibly, you haven't yet indicated how it will ever have an impact on the large-scale, systematic production of the built environment, the large-scale systematic production of the built environment.
Right. I agree. I agree that's the question.
If it's a paradigm, you said this is the 21st century paradigm, it had better address it. The scale is going to grow, so.
Well, right. But the hypothesis is that we should design for all of that time at once when we imagine the project, and that we should design the disappearance of that material, that we should design there's a framework called the circular economy, which I think is fitting for this type of project. We have to design everything from the scale of how that material comes together, its material performance, in this case biological, but doesn't always need to be, to how it comes together, to what the energy required to make the building blocks and the building, where the raw materials come from, and then what happens when it goes away, whether that's a temporary installation or a supposedly permanent building, which is never permanent because of course it eventually goes away, either the cladding first or the whole building. So it was an experiment in a design approach more than, like, the success or failure of this idea doesn't depend on a technical number, which is how many days can this material last if we want it to be as high as possible.
What would you do about the rest of the problem beyond, I don't know, something that's supposed to last 10 years, a week, a month, 10 years? What do you do about the things that should have a lifespan of 100 years or longer? What do you perceive to be how do you apply this investigation of the biodegradable materiality of architecture to that problem of its many temporal
But why
dimensions?
can't it expand? I mean, like a lot of my projects, from the very beginning when they were self-funded, and we had this framework of flash research, $1,000 or less, 3 months or less, but we test out an idea that could scale up by making a prototype.
75 years of duration?
I think you could scale up to 75 years of duration, and you could scale up to the armature stuff. I mean, we had to make this timber armature because of, if you design PS1 these days, you have to design for sustained 75-mile-an-hour winds, probably in a way that you didn't
So what
5
happened
years
to that
ago.
framework? Is it the degrading? What are you doing about it?
So that timber was salvaged New York City scaffolding boards, so it was not a new material.
Okay.
And we returned it to the same place that we got it from, this great salvage material place called Build It Green. So, but why can't it?
There.
Sorry?
I mean, the stakes and the research is suddenly rather rudimentary. You've suddenly shifted you really are going to a different register of research now. You're kind of...
Conventional brick just as sustainable as a biodegradable?
I mean, I have to say,
TMI.
I love the discussion, and sure, we could, we could argue those terms. I think those are terms that should be discussed about our projects. I mean, that was the hypothesis. So already, I mean, these are the stakes of projects, right? That's one set of stakes of projects. And I think that should be discussed. So that was the proposal. I mean, sure, yeah, when you get down to like, I could talk about some other details that would similarly bore you about how we tested.
Right.
No, but it's how you take the big idea and test it with the practical things you need to do to get it done. We took these soft bricks, these like unlikely things to make a big building out of. We didn't know if it would work. We sent them to the same guy who did the accelerated aging for the Berkeley Center, right? The big Corten steel panels, right? You send these panels if you don't know whether the rust is going to be a problem, if you have to artificially rust something in order to get it done for this arena, blah, blah, blah. You send it to this guy, and he puts it in his corrosion chamber and simulates 3 years of weathering in 3 weeks. We sent our bricks to the same guy, and we want to know what's going to happen after 3 years. We're designing this impossible thing. If you have compostability on one end and you have durability on the other end, it's a pretty, linear relationship, right? But it turned out that this seemed viable. 3 years of aging, these things were just as strong. So that's where I think this gets down to the detail. That's less about the idea, it's more about the practicality, but I think it does have the potential. It's also just worth asking, like, should we design the lifespan of every single aspect of the building? And I think that was the proposal.
Not a second question. Okay.
We'll talk about the clay bricks later. But.
I just want you all to know that I have like 3 pages of questions that I did not ask. But we do have to close, and I really appreciate you all coming. Thank you very much.
And we're all here to talk with you if you have individual questions for the panelists.